I thought the cameras would finally give me the truth I had been searching for. I was wrong. They gave me something far more painful, a mirror. And the man staring back at me from that mirror was someone I barely recognized. I'd spent weeks telling myself I was doing the right thing, that installing hidden cameras in my own home was a reasonable decision, that protecting what was mine was simply a father's duty. I had convinced myself that suspicion was the same thing as wisdom. But wisdom doesn't make you set up recording devices aimed at a woman who had quietly kept your world from falling apart. Wisdom doesn't make you humiliate someone in front of your colleagues and closest friends while your daughter watches from across the room. I didn't find a thief that night. I found the truth about who I had become in the years since I lost my wife. And the truth was this: the person I had been watching so carefully, the person I had been so ready to accuse, was the only one in my home who had never once let me down. Her name was Rosa, and what those cameras showed that night changed everything. My name is Daniel. I am 42 years old, and on most days, I look like a man who has everything figured out. I run a mid-sized supply chain company that my late wife, Nora, and I built together from nothing. We started with one office, 2 laptops, and a shared dream. By the time Mia was born, that dream had become something real. We had a beautiful home in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where neighbors wave from their driveways and children ride bikes until the streetlights come on. I had a good life. Then, 3 years ago, I lost Nora to a sudden brain aneurysm. She was 38, healthy, laughing, planning a birthday trip for Mia. And she was gone. No warning. No proper goodbye. After Nora died, I didn't fall apart in ways people could see. I kept showing up to work, kept closing deals, kept sending Mia to school with a packed lunch. But inside, something had gone very quiet. Something that used to keep me warm had switched off entirely. I didn't know how to get it back. I wasn't even sure I deserved to try. So I buried myself in work and distance and told myself that staying functional was the same as being okay. It wasn't. Rosa had come to work for us 2 years before Nora passed. She was a quiet woman in her mid-50s, with careful hands and steady eyes. Nora hired her after Mia started walking, and the house became too much to manage alongside everything else. Rosa didn't talk much, but she worked with a focus that said more than words could. She knew where everything belonged. She made Mia laugh with little paper animals she folded during breaks. She remembered that Nora liked her tea without sugar and that I needed the coffee strong. After Nora died, Rosa stayed. She never asked for more money or change her hours. She simply adjusted. She filled in the gaps quietly, the way water finds its way through stone. She started walking Mia to the bus stop on mornings when I had early calls. She learned to plait Mia's hair when Mia asked. She made dinner without being asked on evenings when the fridge looked bare. I noticed all of it, but I let myself get used to it without ever saying thank you. That was my first failure. I told myself it was her job. I told myself she was paid for her time and that gratitude beyond a paycheck was optional. I was wrong about that too. The missing items started small. A silver pen that had been a gift from a business partner. A decorative watch I kept on the shelf in my study, not one I wore often, but one I noticed. A pair of cufflinks that had belonged to my father. Each time something disappeared, I told myself I had misplaced it. I turned drawers upside down. I checked coat pockets. I retraced steps, but the items never turned up. My sister, Pauline, was the first to say what I had been trying not to think. She came for Sunday dinner, looked around the house with that familiar narrowed gaze, and said, "You can never really know someone who works in your home. Have you considered that the problem might be closer than you think?" I told her that was unfair. That Rosa had been with us for years. Pauline shrugged in that way she does when she believes she is being reasonable and I am being naive. Loyalty isn't guaranteed just because someone shows up every day, she said. I didn't agree with her that night, but her words sat in the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't quite reach. And splinters, if you don't deal with them, have a way of quietly causing damage. The doubt grew slowly, the way something rotten does, quietly, invisibly, until the damage is already done. I started paying attention in ways I never had before. I noticed when Rosa moved through rooms I wasn't in. I tracked small things, where she stood, which drawers she opened, how long she spent in the study. I hated myself for it, even as I did it. But the suspicion had taken root, and I didn't know how to pull it out. The worst part was that nothing Rosa did was suspicious. She cleaned. She cooked. She hummed softly while she folded laundry. She sat with Mia on the kitchen floor and helped her practice reading. She was exactly who she had always been. But instead of letting that reassure me, I twisted it. I told myself that was precisely what a clever person would do. I told myself that truly trustworthy people didn't need to appear so consistent. I was building a story in my head and casting Rosa as the villain because it was easier than admitting I had no explanation for what was missing. Easier than sitting with uncertainty. Easier than asking a direct question. I chose cameras instead of honesty. I chose surveillance instead of conversation. That choice cost us all something we couldn't get back. I ordered the cameras on a Thursday and installed them the following weekend while Rosa was off. They were small and discreet, fitted into ordinary objects: a clock in the kitchen, a small decorative box in the hallway, a bookend in the study. I told myself this was smart, practical, that I was gathering information before drawing any conclusions. I told myself that if Rosa was innocent, the footage would prove it, and I would feel foolish for a day and then move on. But even as I fitted each device in a place, something in my chest felt wrong. Rosa had not given me a single concrete reason to distrust her. Not one. I was acting on whispers, worry, and my sister's pointed suggestion. I was choosing surveillance over simple, direct conversation. But I'd spent 3 years building a wall around my grief, and behind that wall, I had gotten very good at convincing myself that control was the same as safety. The cameras went in. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I just needed to know. I started checking the footage every morning, scrolling through hours of quiet rooms, looking for the thing I was convinced I would find. It was never there, but I kept looking. 2 weeks passed. The footage showed nothing suspicious. Rosa moved through the house the same way she always had, purposefully, gently, without drama. She cleaned. She cooked. She helped Mia with homework at the kitchen table, and sometimes sat with her until Mia fell asleep on the couch. I watched all of it. I watched and still didn't stop. Instead, I adjusted my thinking. I told myself she knew she was being watched. I told myself that was why nothing was showing up. I had gone so deep into suspicion that I had made it impossible to disprove. If nothing happened, she was being careful. If something happened, I would be proven right. There was no version of reality in which Rosa could come out clean in my eyes. I can see that clearly now. I could not see it then. I was too caught up in keeping myself from feeling the real thing underneath all of it. The simple, devastating truth that my life had a hole in it shaped exactly like Nora, and I've been filling it with work and suspicion and control ever since she left. The cameras were never really about Rosa. They were about me. About a man who had lost the one thing he couldn't manage or monitor or fix. The dinner party had been planned for over a month. It was a business occasion, a chance to host 2 senior partners from a company I hoped to bring on as a long-term client. My old university friend, Marcus, was coming with his wife, Tanya. My sister Pauline was also invited because Pauline considered herself essential at any gathering involving my professional life. I had hired a caterer for the main courses, but Rosa had offered to help with setup and serve during the evening. She didn't ask for overtime. She said she wanted to make sure Mia was settled before guests arrived and that the house looked right. I thanked her in the flat, distant way I had been saying everything to her for weeks. The house looked beautiful that night. Rosa had arranged flowers from the garden in low vases along the dining table. The silverware gleamed. When the first guests arrived, I stood at the door in a pressed shirt and smiled the smile of a man who had things under control. Mia stayed close to Rosa in the kitchen, sneaking bites of the dessert tray. Through the glass door, I watched them briefly and felt something warm pass through me. I pushed it aside and went to greet my guests. The evening began well. Marcus and Tanya were easy company, warm, funny, full of good stories. The 2 senior partners, Mr. Adeyemi and his colleague, Mr. Tran, were impressed by the house and relaxed quickly over drinks. Conversation moved from business to sport to the neighborhood. I felt the knot in my shoulders loosen. I was good at this, at performing ease, at being the composed host. Rosa moved through the room with quiet efficiency, clearing glasses, refilling water, never drawing attention to herself. Pauline sat near the head of the table, keeping one eye on Rosa with the familiar narrowed look I had learned not to challenge. At one point, she leaned toward Tanya and said something low, nodding in Rosa's direction. Tanya looked briefly uncomfortable and changed the subject. I saw it from across the table and felt a flash of irritation, but said nothing. Mia had been put to bed just before the guests sat down, but I knew she was likely still awake. She never slept easily when the house was full of voices. I had checked my phone twice during the appetizers. No motion alerts from the cameras. I placed it face down on the table and tried to be present. For a short while, I almost managed it. It was during the main course that everything shifted. Mr. Adeyemi was asking about our logistics model when my phone buzzed. Emotion alert, camera 3. The study. I felt my pulse jump. I kept my expression neutral and excused myself. In the hallway, I opened the camera app. The study appeared empty at first. I scrolled back and saw Rosa had been in there briefly, reaching toward the lower shelf near Nora's old jewelry box. I couldn't see clearly what she took. My jaw tightened. I stood in the hallway with the sound of laughter drifting through from the dining room. I thought about the missing pen, the watch, the cufflinks. I thought about Pauline's words, and I made a decision I would spend a very long time regretting. I walked back in, picked up my glass, and tapped it twice with a spoon. The table quieted. I said I want to make a toast, but first I had something worth sharing with everyone. I pulled up the camera footage on my phone and connected it to the television on the wall. I pressed play. The room went still. Rosa appeared in the doorway with a serving dish in both hands. Her eyes moved from my face to the screen. I did not look away from her. I told the room I had noticed irregularities in my home and had taken steps to address them. I said it in the careful language of logistics, measured and controlled, as though presenting a business finding. Then the footage began. I had expected something clear and damning. The first clip showed Rosa in the study late on a Wednesday night. She wasn't near the shelves I expected. She was sitting at the edge of the desk, writing something down from her phone. A name, a number. Then she opened a small velvet bag I recognized from Nora's jewelry box, took out a bracelet, studied it briefly, and put it in her coat pocket. The table filled with low, confused murmuring. Pauline inhaled sharply. I felt certain then. I looked at Rosa. She was completely still, the serving dish still in her hands, her face pale. She wasn't moving toward the door or reaching for words. She stood there with a stillness I didn't recognize yet as dignity. Mia appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, rubbing one eye, drawn by the changed atmosphere the way children always are. She looked at the screen. She looked at Rosa. Then she looked at me. I didn't look back. I was too locked into what I believed I was doing. I turned to the room and said, in a voice that sounded calm, but came from somewhere hollow, that I believed we were watching someone remove an item that didn't belong to them. There was uncomfortable shifting around the table. Marcus looked at his plate. Mr. Adeyemi and Mr. Tran exchanged a glance. Pauline straightened in her chair. Rosa still said nothing. She simply lowered her eyes. In that moment, I read her silence as guilt. It was not guilt. It was the practiced quiet of someone who has learned that defending herself in a room that has already decided would only cost her more. The footage kept playing automatically. I had not intended it to run past the clip I had selected, but the feed continued, and what came next stopped everything. The timestamp shifted, same study, 2 nights earlier. Rosa was sitting on the floor with Mia beside her. It was past 10 at night. Mia was crying the kind of deep, shaking cry that follows a nightmare. Rosa had her arms around her, rocking gently. The camera had no sound, but I could read my daughter's face, the way it slowly calmed, the way her hands curled into Rosa's sleeve like she was holding onto something safe. Rosa didn't leave when Mia fell back asleep. She stayed on the floor, back against the desk, watching over her. The room was completely silent. No one touched a glass or shifted in their chair. I stood at the head of the table and watched myself be undone. The feed moved to the next clip, the kitchen, early Monday morning. Rosa was on the phone again, writing down the same number I had seen before. Then I saw what she was doing. She was calling Mia's school, asking about an overdue fee for the art workshop. Then she opened her own purse and paid it over the phone. I had forgotten that fee entirely. It had arrived on a day of back-to-back meetings, and Mia had slid the envelope under a stack of papers on my desk. It sat unread for 2 weeks. I never paid it. Rosa had, with her own money, writing the amount carefully in a small notebook from her apron pocket, clearly planning to tell me, not trying to hide anything. The table was absolutely still. Tanya had her hand over her mouth. Marcus stared at the tablecloth. Mr. Adeyemi watched me with an expression I didn't yet have the courage to read. Pauline, for the first time all evening, was completely silent. I couldn't look away from the screen. Another clip appeared. Rosa at the front door late at night, double-checking the locks after I'd gone to bed. Then Rosa pausing outside Mia's bedroom door, pressing her hand flat against the wood before walking quietly away. These were not the actions of someone stealing from my home. These were the actions of someone holding it together. I looked at Mia in the doorway. She wasn't rubbing her eye anymore. She was watching the screen with the careful attention of a child who has understood something for a long time and is waiting for the adults to catch up. Rosa had still not moved or raised her voice. She stood in the doorway with the serving dish, straight-backed and pale, accepting everything the room was doing to her with a quiet that cracked something open in me. I had accused her in front of my guests. I had put her face on a screen. I had treated 3 years of loyalty like a suspect file. And she had not crumbled. She had not shouted. She had simply stood there and let the truth play out because she knew that truth was the only thing in the room that was actually on her side. Then Mia walked forward. She didn't run or shout. She moved across the dining room with a steadiness that seemed too large for her small body and stopped near the center of the table where everyone could see her. She looked at the screen where the footage still played. Rosa late at night, checking doors, pausing outside her bedroom. Then Mia turned to the room. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. She said, "She's not the one stealing. She's the one who stayed when you didn't." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I could not speak. Mia looked directly at me, and I understood exactly what she meant. Not with anger, not with cruelty, with the clear, unguarded honesty children carry before the world teaches them to soften their truths. She meant Rosa had been there every night, for nightmares and school forms and meals and the kind of loneliness that doesn't make a sound. She meant I had been somewhere else, behind work and grief and the performance of being fine. She meant our home had a hole in it, and Rosa was the only one who had been quietly, consistently trying to fill it. She was 9 years old, and she was the only honest person in the room. The room fell apart without drama, not with shouting, just the slow, quiet collapse of a carefully built illusion. Mr. Adeyemi set his napkin on his plate and said softly that perhaps they should give the family some space. Mr. Tran nodded and pushed back his chair. I didn't stop them. Marcus stood and put a hand briefly on my shoulder as he passed. He didn't say anything, which was the right call. There was nothing useful left to say. Pauline gathered her things without making eye contact with me. The room emptied, slowly, like water draining from a bowl. When only Mia and Rosa and I remained, I finally looked at Rosa directly. She had set the serving dish down on the sideboard. She was standing straight. Her face was tired and calm in equal measure. She didn't look angry. She looked like someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a long time and had finally put it down, not because anyone helped her, but because she had nothing left to prove. I tried to speak. The words didn't come. My mouth opened and nothing followed. I had built an entire case against a woman whose only crime was caring about my daughter more carefully than I had managed to. Rosa reached behind her and untied her apron. She folded the way she folded everything, with care and precision, and placed it neatly on the sideboard. She was not making a dramatic exit. She was not performing anything. She was choosing to leave on her own terms, and that quiet act of self-possession was more powerful than any speech she could have given. I thought about all the things I wanted to say. I wanted to explain about the missing items in Pauline's words and the fear that had grown in me without my noticing. I wanted to tell her she was the most trustworthy person in my life, and that what I had done was not about her, but about grief I had never learned to carry. But none of those words came out, because some apologies need to happen immediately, and if you miss the moment, they shrink into nothing. Rosa moved toward the hallway. Mia made a small sound beside me, the beginning of a word that didn't make it out. She moved first. She ran after Rosa and caught her by the hand. Rosa stopped and turned and crouched, so they were level. I couldn't hear what they said to each other. It was private, the way the most important things always are. I watched Rosa put both hands on the sides of Mia's face, the way you do with someone you love. I saw Mia nod. I saw Rosa smile, a real smile, tired but genuine, and press her forehead to Mia's before standing up. Then she walked to the front door, picked up her bag from the hook where it always hung, and left. The door closed. Not slammed, just closed. That soft, final sound was worse than any door I had ever heard slam in anger. Mia stood in the hallway for a moment, then walked to the couch and sat down with her stuffed rabbit without a word. I stood in the dining room among the half-empty glasses and the cold food and the flowers Rosa had cut from my own garden that morning, arranged carefully in low vases. I had never felt so alone in a room, still full of things someone else had made beautiful. The dinner party was over, but something larger was over too, and I was only beginning to understand the size of it. I had come into the evening believing I was about to expose a thief. Instead, I had exposed myself, my neglect, my fear, my complete inability to see the people right in front of me for what they actually were. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the study and went through all the footage again, not looking for theft, looking at what was actually there. 47 nights. 47 nights in which Rosa had done something I hadn't known about or thought to ask about. She had given Mia her medication on the nights I forgot. She had remade Mia's bed at 2 in the morning after a nightmare, smoothing the sheets before turning off the light. She had found Nora's old recipe card for Mia's favorite soup and followed it step by step on a Sunday afternoon. She had used her own money 3 separate times. Once for the school fee, once for a birthday gift for Mia's classmate when I missed the notice entirely, once for a textbook I had promised to order and never did. All 3 times she had written the amounts in a small notebook, planning to tell me later. There was no deception in any of those 47 nights. Not once. I went looking for the missing items, too. The pen had rolled behind the filing cabinet. The watch had been moved by a cleaning service I had brought in while Rosa was ill. The cufflinks were in my winter coat pocket. Every single thing had an explanation. None of those explanations were Rosa. A clip of that evening appeared online the following day. One of the guests had recorded part of it on their phone. Not the full footage, just the moment Mia stepped forward and spoke. The clip was 22 seconds long. By the time I found it, it had already been shared thousands of times. The comments were not kind to me. I read them longer than I should have. People called me cold, arrogant, careless with the people who served me. Some were harsher. There was a post from a woman who said she worked as a domestic helper and that what happened to Rosa had happened to her twice. That she had never forgotten the shame of standing in a room where everyone chose to believe the worst. I read that 3 times. I deserved every word. My professional reputation took a real hit in the weeks that followed. 2 contacts I had hoped to impress quietly went with a different company. I told myself it was coincidence. I knew it wasn't. But the professional damage was the smallest cost. The things I kept returning to were Rosa's face in that doorway, Mia's voice in a silent room, and the soft sound of a door closing on the version of myself I could no longer pretend to be. Pauline called the morning after. I expected her to be defensive, to lean on the idea that she had only been trying to protect me, and that her concerns had been reasonable. Instead, she was quiet. She said she had been awake all night. Then she said she was sorry. I had never heard Pauline apologize for anything in my adult life, and the sound of it, halting, genuine, made me sit down heavily. She told me something I hadn't known. Rosa had called her months earlier asking if Pauline could remind me about Mia's upcoming birthday, because she was worried I would forget and she didn't want Mia to go without. Pauline had helped her. She had never told me. Then she had turned around and planted the seeds of suspicion about the same woman. I asked her why. There was a long pause. She said she thought she had been protecting me. We both knew there was more underneath that, something about family lines and who was allowed to matter most in my home. But neither of us had the words for it yet. What I did know was that I had let someone else's unexamined feelings shape my own judgment entirely, and that had cost Rosa something she had done absolutely nothing to deserve. Mia didn't mention Rosa for several days. She went to school, came home, ate her dinners. She was polite and careful around me, the way children are when they have witnessed something large and are still working out what it means. On the fourth morning, she sat across from me at breakfast and asked, in a very steady voice, whether I was going to say sorry to Rosa. I told her I was planning to find her. Mia said, "Planning is different from doing, Dad." She was right. I had been planning things for 3 years, planning to be more present, planning to sort through Nora's things, planning to take Mia on the trip Nora had been organizing before she died. All of it still unplanned. Planning was the story I told myself to feel less guilty about standing still. Mia finished her cereal and picked up her bag. Before she walked out, she said, "Rosa used to tell me you were sad, not mean." She said sad people sometimes do mean things because they don't know what else to do with the sad. Then she left. I stayed at the table for a long time, not moving, letting those words find their way into all the places I kept carefully sealed. I found Rosa 6 weeks later. It took longer than it should have, partly because I was ashamed and partly because I wanted to approach it correctly. Not with a gesture designed to ease my guilt, but with something honest. I found her through a mutual contact who ran a community center in the neighboring district. Rosa had taken a position there 3 weeks after leaving my house. She had accepted a lower salary without hesitation. I drove to the center on a Thursday morning. It was a bright, low-ceilinged building with children's drawings along the walls and a small garden out back. Rosa was in the garden helping an elderly man arrange seedlings in a row of containers. She saw me before I reached her. She didn't look away. She also didn't move toward me. She waited. I walked across the garden and stopped a few feet from her. I told her I was sorry. Not the polished version I had rehearsed on the drive over. The plain one. I told her she had done nothing to deserve what I did. That she had been the best constant in our home since Nora, and I had been too deep in my own damage to see it. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at me quietly and said, "I know." We talked for almost an hour on a bench at the side of the garden. Rosa told me things I hadn't known. She said that in the months after Nora died, she had considered leaving because the grief in the house was so heavy she sometimes found it hard to breathe inside it. But she had stayed because of Mia. She told me that Mia used to climb into her lap some evenings and ask questions about her mother, what she had been like, what her laugh sounded like. Rosa had answered every question honestly because she had known Nora, and she believed Mia had a right to those memories. I had not known any of this was happening. I had not been the one Mia came to with those questions. I had to sit quietly with that for a while. Rosa told me she was happy in her new position and said it without bitterness. I believed her completely. I asked if she would ever consider coming back, and she said no, gently, without apology. She hoped I would understand. I did. I asked if Mia could visit her sometimes, and Rosa's face changed. It softened in a way that reminded me of the footage, her hand pressed flat against Mia's bedroom door in the dark. She said she would like that very much. It has been 7 months since that dinner party. My life looks different now in ways that are small and slow and more important than anything I built while hiding behind work. I take Mia to school most mornings myself. I have been to every school event this term. We were planning the trip Nora had been organizing. Mia picked the destination from a map and circled it 3 times so I would know she was serious. I found the cufflinks in my coat pocket and wear them now, not as a reminder of loss, but because they were my father's and they belong out in the world. I still think about Rosa often, about the quiet, steady way she moved through our home, about the 47 nights I watched without seeing, about my daughter walking to the center of that silent room and speaking a truth I hadn't been capable of saying myself. The cameras came down the same night. I went through all the footage before I had decided anything else. It felt like the only right thing left. Sometimes the people we doubt the most are the ones silently saving us. I understand that now in a way that lives in my bones. Rosa didn't need me to see her, but I needed to. And because of one small girl in her pajamas, I finally did.